Welcome to What Are You Reading? Podcast with the Public Library of Mount Vernon in Knox County. I'm Christy, and today we're going to be interviewing our co-host, Katie. So, what are you reading?
Well, what I brought today is Becoming Mrs. Lewis. It is a historical fiction book about the woman who met and eventually married C.S. Lewis.
That's very cool. I was wondering, we've talked about this a little bit as we've been working, because you read it not too long ago. And one of the main things that I was interested to talk to you about was how this historical fiction made you interested in reading the nonfiction stories.
Yeah. So the woman who becomes Mrs. Lewis, her name's Joy Davidman, and she's actually a poet in her own right. And C.S. Lewis was a well-known letter writer as well as everything else that he did. So while I was reading this, I was able to get a hold of a book of her poetry and a book of her letters to C.S. Lewis. And it just added a whole lot to the story. There's also some controversy as to whether or not Joy Davidman really cared for C.S. Lewis, or if it was just like a marriage of convenience. She died 4 years after they were married, so it was a very short romance.
What was something that you really learned about C.S. Lewis? Even though this is, we'll get back to, her, but what was something you learned about him?
I really didn't know a whole lot about him. I was an English major in college, so I knew him primarily for his works on medieval literature. And I'd read some of the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe books. But I didn't realize, and I knew he was a bachelor for most of his life, but I didn't realize that he primarily lived with his brother for pretty much his entire life. He also spent some time, their home was, and I can't remember what it's called now, but they had their home, and then he also had rooms at the college where he worked. So he kind of spent his time in two different places. Which was interesting. And I didn't realize that he had to actually tutor students as well as teach classes. So he was a very busy man.
I guess so.
Yeah.
So that didn't really lend him a lot of time to have probably a lot of like building friendships or relationships or anything like that. How did they meet?
So she had what she figured was a religious experience. And she was an atheist turned communist turned Christian.
Wow.
So,
interesting.
Yeah. So she was still trying to figure out what had happened to her and where she was supposed to go from there. And a mutual acquaintance said, you should really write to Jack. That's what C.S. Lewis was called by his friends. So you should write to Jack. He loves talking to people about this stuff. And she did, and they exchanged letters back and forth for, I think, a year or two. And she actually was able to travel to England. She was researching a book and then spent some time, the Kilns was their home. So got to spend some time at the Kilns, and that's where they really solidified their friendship. And then eventually it blossomed into their relationship that ended in marriage.
Was she from the States?
Yes. That was one of the reasons that a lot of his friends did not like her. Because she was a brash American woman. She was also married. Her husband was an alcoholic. And she was very sickly. And the trip to England was in part to do research for a book, but also for her to take some time away where she could recoup and get back to where she needed to be health-wise.
And how did their relationship kind of move forward after that kind of like initial time she spent in England with him?
So they continued to write letters to each other. They spent a lot of time together while she was in England. At one point, she spent Christmas with them.
Wow.
And one of her sons came and got to spend a Christmas with all of them. But she decided she wanted to stay in England. And initially, according to the book, they wouldn't renew her visa.
Oh.
So she and Jack decided to have a civil ceremony and get married. And then they continued to live in two separate locations. But then she got sick again. And they decided to live together and be actually husband and wife. And she had already divorced her husband. It happened not too long after she got back from England.
Okay, from that first visit.
Yeah. So, yeah.
How do you think, now that we'd mentioned earlier, you went back and kind of looked more into the nonfiction side of things and learned more about them as people outside of the historical fiction that's in this book. How do you think that Patty, like, how well do you think this was built off of fact?
It is very true to the relationship as I understand it. She actually went to the place where Joy Davidman's letters were and read them all.
Wow.
So she based it on that. Unfortunately, C.S. Lewis was in the habit of burning letters after he read them. So
wow.
I don't think she read many of his letters, but definitely the ones that Joy wrote him. She also read some of her poetry. I think there's some of her poetry is in here as well at the beginning of some of the chapters.
Well, that's a nice touch to kind of get you probably kind of hooked. Like you want to dig in and actually read something that Joy wrote.
Right.
Well, that's very cool. Was there anything that you found surprising about their story?
That they seem to have a working partnership as well as like their personal lives together. The book portrays her as kind of his editor for a lot of things. They bounced ideas off of each other. One of his books, I believe it's called Till We Have Two Faces or something like that. It was based on a Greek myth. They collaborated to come up with the idea for it.
Okay.
So, and obviously when she passed away, he wrote a book about how devastated he was after she passed.
Wow.
Which to me solidified that she was not just trying to find some brilliant older man to take care of her. She really did care about him. And at least he cared about her a great deal.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like there was so much more to their relationship than what I assume, because I think we've talked about this before. His circle of friends was very cautious of her. So seeing those inner workings and how her influence affected his writing, it's really hard to argue against, them having a real relationship.
Yeah, it was just unfortunate that she had the background that she had.
Yeah.
She did want to make sure that her children were going to be raised by Jack and not her husband if something happened to her. She wanted to stay in England, but she was a young, attractive woman. She could have married whoever she wanted, really, but she had a connection with him. So,
Were the children able to stay with C.S. Lewis after her passing?
They were. It was when she was ill, right before they did their religious ceremony wedding, Jack wrote to her ex-husband and basically said, the boys will be staying here.
Wow.
And at the time, they were a very poor family. There was no way he could have gone across to England to get the boys back.
Mm-hmm.
But by then he had remarried and had a new family to take care of.
Mm-hmm.
So didn't have the means to fight it. Unfortunately, Lewis, I think, passed away 3 years after she did.
Wow.
So the boys had a lot of tragedy in their life.
Yeah. Do we, where do we stop with this? I guess we should have said spoiler alert here.
Yeah.
A long time ago.
Well, yeah.
But where do we end with the boys in the book?
It's been a little while, so I'm not sure, but I think it does end when she after she passes away.
Mm-hmm.
And then she does have an epilogue that says kind of what happened to the other players after she passed away.
Sure. Would you recommend this book to other people?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would definitely recommend looking into Joy David Min's work and C.S. Lewis's letters as well. It's really fascinating to see how life was and how their relationship went from friendship to romance.
Yeah, that is really interesting because I had a very limited introduction to C.S. Lewis. I'm a Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe person. Past that, I didn't know too much. Had no idea about this marriage or much about Joy. So definitely talking to you about it had made me interested as well to kind of, get more into the nonfiction side, find their writings, learn more about them as people. As authors, it's always interesting, but as people as well. So
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, and the book does cover some of the thought processes for some of C.S. Lewis's books. So it was nice to get a little glimpse of where his ideas came from.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I wondered if any of his friends or people around him noticed her influence. We talked about after her death, he wrote. But did they mention noticing her having an influence on his writing?
Not that I can remember. I think it was mostly her influencing his social calendar.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you so much for sharing with us.
Well, thank you.
I think that's a really interesting story, and I'm glad that we're kind of talking a little bit more about historical fiction, things that get us to ask more questions, dig a little deeper. So that's great.
Yep.
Well, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you guys for watching. Hit that like, subscribe. Definitely stay tuned for more podcasts from us in the future.